Alright, so in this lecture I want to talk about the feature of Sass that we've already seen used and that you probably also know from CSS, and those are imports. So we've already seen them when we imported our partials right here. So for our variables partial and also for our mixins partial, we use this add_import directive to basically import all the code that is in these files into this place where we have our import directive. And this allowed us to make our code more modular. So we were able to put our variables in a separate file and also to put our mixins in a separate file, so that each of those files is more comprehensible and we can also just reuse them in other projects. Now the import directive in Sass is similar to the CSS directive, but it's more powerful. So in many cases the Sass import is just going to be a normal CSS import. In fact, there are 4 cases where this is true. So where our Sass imports are just normal CSS imports. And that is, first of all, if we import something that starts with URL. So for example, if we want to import a font and we use this URL syntax, then this is going to be a normal CSS import because CSS supports this as well. So Sass is just going to go ahead and just generate a CSS import from this. And similarly, if you want to import something that starts with HTTP, then that's also going to be generated to a normal CSS import. Now the third case where this happens is when you import something like filename.css, where you have this CSS extension, because this is also something that CSS is capable of. Now the last kind of import that just becomes a CSS import is if we import something like our style for the screen, and then we have some kind of media query after this. So for example, this style sheet should only be applied for screens, which means it's not going to affect the print layout, for example. So again, this is something that CSS can do for us. So Sass is just going to go ahead and make this a CSS import. Alright, so those are the 4 cases where we have normal CSS imports, but the Sass imports actually offer some more capabilities, and that is they allow us to import Sass and SCSS files. So let's first get rid of these example imports. Now we've already seen the Sass imports in action when we use them to import our mixins and variables partials. So these are not going to be translated to CSS imports, but instead they're going to include these SCSS files for us. So this is something that CSS cannot do. And we've also already seen that we don't need to put an underscore here, and we also don't need to put the file extension. So that makes these import statements more readable. Now what I haven't mentioned explicitly yet is the way that Sass actually looks for these files. And the way this works is that the Sass preprocessor goes ahead and looks at the current directory we're in. So in our main SCSS file, we're in our SCSS directory. So when we just put in variables here, then that's going to go ahead and look for this variables partial, for example. Now this doesn't have to be a partial, so this could also just be a normal SCSS file without any underscores before it, but it's still going to import that, so we can import any SCSS or Sass files that we want. But it will also look for partials, so it's also going to look for files with an underscore before them. And so then when it finds this, it's going to import that right where we used our import directive. Now there's one thing to be aware of. Because of this way that the Sass preprocessor handles these imports, we are not allowed to have a normal variables.scss file here without an underscore, and also this partial with underscore variables.scss, because then it wouldn't be clear which of those files we want to import if we import the variables like here. Because then the preprocessor would have no chance to know what we actually want to import if we just write import variables. And this is a correct statement, but if we had a file with an underscore and also without an underscore, then it's not clear which of those 2 files we actually want to import. So you cannot have 2 files with the same name, which are just different by the underscore at the beginning. Alright, so we just specify a relative path here. And to make this a bit clearer, let's actually go ahead and create a new folder in here, and let's call this partials. And now let's move our 2 partials into this new directory. Now note that the Sublime text editor doesn't have a really sophisticated sidebar, so you can't do that right here, so there's no option to do that. If you want to, you can install a package called sidebar enhancements, and that's going to do it for you. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and use the file explorer. Alright, so I'm just going to go into the SCSS folder, and then I'm going to move both of these files into the partials folder. So now what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go to our main SCSS file, and we'll have to change these paths now. And as I said, we use relative paths. So if we have a folder like this in our SCSS directory, we can just put the name in front here and then add a slash. So we now want to import the partials/variables and the partials/mixins. And in fact, this directory structure is common in larger Sass projects. So you usually define your own directory for your partials. Alright, so that's how these relative paths work. You may be familiar with this from CSS code or some other programming language, but if not, you should now get the idea. Alright, so I want to quickly mention one last thing, and that is that we can also use one import directive to import multiple files. So we could also use a comma here, save this, and that's also going to go ahead and include both of our files. But I usually prefer to have an import statement for each file because I just find it more readable. But if you want, you could use one import directive to import multiple files at once. Awesome, so those are all the basics about imports. So in many cases, the import statement is just going to be translated to a CSS import statement, but whenever we want to actually import a Sass or SCSS file, then that's going to go ahead and do something different because, well, CSS doesn't know about SCSS files. So this is an additional capability of these Sass imports. If you're having any trouble with this or any questions left, just ask me in the discussions, and I will then see you in the next lecture.